Welcome to today's discussion. Picture this, a seismic shift in the heart of Europe, where the election of Poland's new president, Karol Nawrocki, is sending shockwaves through the European Union and beyond. Today, we're unpacking Nawrocki's positions versus the pro-EU policy agenda, drawing from his own statements and campaign pledges, as well as the priorities of the European Commission and the Tusk government. Buckle up, because this is a story of clashing visions, rising populism, and a continent at a crossroads. In sum, President Nawrocki is likely to embolden Poland's opposition to liberal EU policies across the board. Where the EU pushes climate regulations or Green Deal targets, expect Poland to balk. Nawrocki has signaled skepticism toward EU climate regulations as burdensome. Where the EU calls for unity on issues like Ukraine, Nawrocki may inject a more transactional tone. He has even criticized Kyiv's EU and NATO ambitions and played to anti-Ukrainian sentiment over refugees in Poland. This represents a stark shift. Poland under Tusk was a key advocate for a united EU front, but under Nawrocki's influence, Poland could become an outlier aligned with the bloc's illiberal wing. As one expert put it, the election outcome is very bad news for the European Union. Nawrocki's victory will have a chilling effect on Poland's pro-EU ambitions. Brussels now faces a more combative Polish presidency that views many liberal EU initiatives as threats to Polish sovereignty and values, potentially leading to more vetoes, legal battles, and diplomatic rifts ahead. Nawrocki's win reverberates far beyond Poland's borders. It signals a resurgence of right-wing populism in the heart of Europe, emboldening nationalist leaders and parties across the continent. After a period where pro-EU centrists seemed ascendant, with Tusk's 2023 victory in Poland and other moderates winning elections, the pendulum has swung. European conservatives and far-right figures are celebrating Nawrocki's triumph as part of a broader nationalist revival. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban hailed it as a fantastic victory, and Hungary's foreign minister cheered a fresh victory for patriots. In France, Marine Le Pen praised Nawrocki's win as a rebuff to the Brussels oligarchy that wants to impose uniform policies on nations. Italy's Giorgia Meloni, who leads a hard-right government in Rome, likewise sees Poland's election as reinforcement for the EU-critical anti-migrant camp she champions. As The Guardian notes, the nationalists' win is a boost for Europe's populist, EU-critical parties, led by Italy's Meloni and Hungary's Orban. These leaders share Nawrocki's opposition to EU migrant quotas and liberal social norms, so his success in Poland strengthens their collective stance. Indeed, one immediate impact will be greater pressure on the EU's refugee and migration policies from a coalition of right-wing governments. Poland under Nawrocki joins Hungary under Orban in staunchly rejecting EU refugee relocation schemes. They argue for fortress-like border security and national decision-making over who gets asylum. Now, with Italy's government also prioritizing strict migration control, cracking down on Mediterranean migrant boats, a powerful bloc is forming within the EU that can stymie or dilute common policies. This was already visible when the EU's asylum reform was being negotiated. Poland and Hungary voted against the pact, and other like-minded governments voiced strong reservations. Nawrocki's ascent will harden Poland's stance in these discussions and encourage others, such as the conservative governments in Slovakia, or potentially a future right-led government in the Netherlands, to resist EU-wide refugee burden sharing. The collective message from this camp is clear. Each nation will decide its own immigration intake, and attempts by Brussels to mandate solidarity are unwelcome. As a result, we can expect EU migration policy to tilt more toward enforcement and border protection, as centrist leaders accommodate voter anxiety that the populists have tapped into. Nawrocki's win may also lend momentum to right-wing opposition figures in upcoming elections elsewhere. For example, in the Czech Republic, Eurosceptic ex-PM Andrej Babiš was quick to congratulate Nawrocki and could ride a similar nationalist message in his own election bid. In Romania, a far-right candidate, George Simeon, lauded the result as Poland won, framing it as an inspiration for nationalists despite his recent defeat. These reactions illustrate how Poland's election has energized a pan-European network of populists who see their ideas validated in a major EU member state. Even in Western Europe, where far-right parties are in opposition, leaders like France's Jordan Bardella, Marine Le Pen's successor, cited the Polish people's choice as an assertion of democratic sovereignty against EU elites. Such rhetoric may galvanize right-leaning voters across Europe and pressure mainstream parties to adopt tougher stances on issues like immigration. A particular policy area to watch is how this right-wing resurgence shapes the EU's refugee strategy. With more national leaders openly defying Brussels on migrant quotas, the EU might be forced to compromise. We could see a shift towards stricter external border controls, more funding for border security, and an emphasis on deportation of illegitimate asylum seekers, policies long championed by Central Europe's conservatives and now gaining traction more widely. Countries resistant to hosting refugees could band together to demand alternatives, such as providing financial aid to frontline states or outsourcing asylum processing outside Europe. In effect, Nawrocki and his allies are moving the Overton window. What was once viewed as a hardline stance, like refusing any refugee intakes, is becoming part of the EU dialogue due to the weight of multiple governments. EU officials like Commission President Ursula von der Leyen insist on continuing very good cooperation with Poland. But the reality is that Nawrocki's Poland will cooperate on its own terms, especially on migration. At the same time, Nawrocki's leadership could deepen splits within the EU, prompting a counter-reaction by pro-EU forces. We see early signs of this in Poland itself. Nawrocki's narrow win, 50.89%, versus 49.11%, means half the country is deeply worried or even disturbed by the result. The liberal half of Poland fears an erosion of democratic norms and a hostile stance toward Europe. This mirrors the broader EU dynamic. While populists cheer, others recoil. Prime Minister Tusk's government, for example, is scrambling to reassure allies and may double down on pro-EU commitments to compensate for the president's posture. In Germany and France, leaders might strengthen their partnerships and emphasize rule of law conditions in EU funding to signal that deviation has costs. In effect, Nawrocki's presidency could act as a rallying point for both the right and the center-left in Europe, intensifying the ongoing battle over Europe's soul, especially on issues of migration and national sovereignty. Karol Nawrocki's ascent comes at a pivotal time, with the European political landscape already in flux. In 2024, Europeans voted in a new European Parliament, and by 2025, a new European Commission will take shape, all amid charged debates on migration, security, and the economy. Nawrocki's presidency is likely to influence these EU-wide developments in several ways. The strong showing of right-wing forces in Poland will echo in Brussels. To avoid ceding further ground to populists, even centrist and center-right European leaders may harden their policy proposals on immigration and security. We have seen how Trzaskowski, a liberal, felt compelled to talk tough on migration during the campaign, promising to deport foreign criminals and limit benefits for refugees in order to win over conservative voters. Similarly, ahead of the 2024 European Parliament elections, mainstream parties in many countries adopted stricter migration planks to blunt the appeal of the far right. Nawrocki's win validates this approach, suggesting that voter sentiment in the EU is indeed tilting toward demands for stricter migration control and preservation of national traditions. We can expect the next European Commission to propose more robust border measures or compromises that placate countries like Poland, for instance, more flexibility on how to show solidarity instead of mandatory refugee relocations. Climate policy might also be moderated as right-wing gains create pushback on the EU's Green Deal mandates. The symbolism of Poland, the EU's sixth largest economy, electing a Trump-aligned nationalist will not be lost on voters elsewhere. It could energize right-leaning voters in countries with upcoming elections. For instance, Spain's late 2024 general election, France's preparations for 2027, and Germany's 2025 federal election may all feel aftershocks. Polls might start reflecting increased support for anti-establishment parties who promise to take back control in a manner similar to Nawrocki. Conversely, Nawrocki's narrow victory and the specter of democratic backsliding might also motivate pro-EU and liberal voters to turn out in force to counter the populists. Much as Poland saw its highest ever turnout for a presidential vote, over 70%, Europe's 2024 parliamentary elections could witness high engagement driven by these stark choices. The new European Parliament will likely have a larger contingent of nationalist and right-wing MEPs, which could form a sizable opposition bloc pressuring for tougher migration and anti-federalist policies. Pro-EU coalitions, on the other hand, may band together more tightly to keep extremists out of key positions. Nawrocki's Poland is set to collaborate more with like-minded governments, potentially reshaping alliance dynamics in the EU. We might see a stronger Eastern and Central European conservative bloc comprising Poland, Hungary, possibly Slovenia or others, coordinating their stance in the European Council. Italy, under Meloni, adds weight to this axis from Western Europe's side. This could complicate consensus building in the EU, where many sensitive issues, like a common asylum policy or sanctions on member states violating rule of law, require unanimity or broad support. If Poland and Hungary continue to wield vetoes on EU budget or foreign policy decisions, for example, they could extract concessions or stall initiatives. On the other hand, more integrationist countries could respond by seeking ways around vetoes, for example, using qualified majority voting more often for migration policies, as was done to pass the Asylum Pact over Polish and Hungarian objections. In extreme scenarios, a core of EU states might pursue coalitions of the willing on certain policies, isolating the recalcitrant members. Thus, Poland's tilt under Nawrocki could either galvanize a larger conservative coalition within the EU or prompt the majority to isolate the troublemakers, a tension that will unfold through 2025. Specific upcoming decisions will test the influence of Nawrocki and his allies. For example, the implementation of the new EU Migration Pact in 2025 to 26 may now face hurdles. Poland's government, even if led by Tusk, will be under pressure from Nawrocki and public opinion to resist taking in refugees allocated by Brussels. We may see legal challenges. Poland's government had already signaled the pact might violate its constitution, and possibly referendums or public votes weaponized by the right to overturn EU-mandated policies. Another area is EU enlargement. Nawrocki has criticized Kyiv's EU and NATO accession plans and opposed Ukraine's NATO membership timeline, which could affect consensus on these issues. Poland was formerly Ukraine's staunch champion. A cooler stance in Warsaw could slow the political momentum for fast-tracking Ukraine's membership talks. In the European Council, Nawrocki's influence, even though the Polish president does not directly sit there, could be exerted via Poland's voice on big questions like EU treaty changes or budget negotiations. If he coordinates with the Polish government's opposition, where PIS still holds considerable parliamentary power, he could force Poland to take tougher negotiating lines. Ultimately, Nawrocki's presidency crystallizes a broader trend in Europe: the rise of assertive right-wing leaders pushing back against the EU's liberal consensus on migration and sovereignty. It adds to the collective weight of those voices and will likely steer the EU's political debate in 2025 toward the issues populists prioritize: border security, national identity, and skepticism of centralized authority. For the European Union, this presents a dual challenge: how to address legitimate public concerns that fuel populism, such as unmanaged migration or economic inequality, while safeguarding the core values of openness, rule of law, and solidarity. As one Polish expert noted, Donald Tusk himself has recognized that beating populism requires addressing some of the issues that drive it. Going forward, we can expect the EU establishment to adapt its policies, for example, by investing more in external border protection or negotiating readmission agreements to deport migrants in order to undercut the appeal of the far right. At the same time, pro-EU leaders will likely emphasize the tangible costs of nationalist policies, such as lost EU funds or diplomatic isolation, to persuade voters of the benefits of cooperation. In summary, Karol Nawrocki's rise to Poland's presidency is not an isolated event, but a bellwether for Europe's political evolution. His hardline conservative ideology, rooted in Catholic nationalist values and fortified by Trump-like populism, promises to reshape Poland's domestic course and put Warsaw on a collision path with Brussels on issues from immigration to judiciary reforms. The ripple effects across Europe are already visible. Right-wing movements are invigorated, EU policy debates are shifting rightward, and the stage is set for a contentious period leading into the 2024-2025 European political cycle. Whether this trend coalesces into a durable conservative counter-revolution in the EU or triggers a backlash that reaffirms liberal integration will be one of the defining storylines of European politics in the coming years. What is clear is that Nawrocki, as Poland's president, will be a key player in this drama, symbolizing both the appeal of nationalist conservatism to many voters and the profound challenge it poses to the European Union's cohesion and values.